The Well of Loneliness, by Radclyffe Hall, with a commentary by Havelock Ellis. Today, we'll explore The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe Hall, a classic LGBTQ+ novel, while helping you improve your English skills through narration and vocabulary tips. Chapter 5. 1. On the Monday that followed Stephen's first day out hunting, she woke with something very like a weight on her chest. In less than 2 minutes she knew why this was. She was going to tea with the Antrums. Her relations with other children were peculiar. She thought so herself, and so did the children. They could not define it, and neither could Stephen, but there it was all the same. A high-spirited child, she should have been popular, and yet she was not, a fact which she divined, and this made her feel ill at ease with her playmates, who in their turn felt ill at ease. She would think that the children were whispering about her, whispering and laughing for no apparent reason, but although this had happened on one occasion, it was not always happening as Stephen imagined. She was painfully hypersensitive at times, and she suffered accordingly. Of all the children that Stephen most dreaded, Violet and Roger Antrim took precedence, especially Roger, who was 10 years old, and already full to the neck of male arrogance. He had just been promoted to Eton's that winter, which added to his overbearing pride. Roger Antrim had round, brown eyes like his mother, and a short, straight nose that might one day be handsome. He was rather a thick-set, plump little boy, whose buttocks looked too large in a short Eton jacket, especially when he stuck his hands in his pockets and strutted, which he did very often. Roger was a bully. He bullied his sister, and would dearly have loved to bully Stephen, but Stephen nonplussed him. Her arms were so strong. He could never wrench Stephen's arms backwards like Violet's. He could never make her cry or show any emotion when he pinched her, or tugged roughly at her new hair ribbon, and then Stephen would often beat him at games, a fact which he deeply resented. She could bowl at cricket much straighter than he could. She climbed trees with astonishing skill and prowess, and even if she did tear her skirts in the process, it was obviously cheek for a girl to climb at all. Violet never climbed trees. She stood at the bottom admiring the courage of Roger. He grew to hate Stephen as a kind of rival, a kind of intruder into his especial province. He was always longing to take her down a peg, but being slow-witted he was foolish in his methods. No good daring Stephen, she responded at once, and usually went one better. As for Stephen, she loathed him, and her loathing was increased by a most humiliating consciousness of envy. Yes, despite his shortcomings, she envied young Roger with his thick, clumping boots, his cropped hair and his Etons, envied his school and his masculine companions of whom he would speak grandly as all the other fellows. Envied his right to climb trees and play cricket and football, his right to be perfectly natural. Above all, she envied his splendid conviction that being a boy constituted a privilege in life. She could well understand that conviction, but this only increased her envy. Stephen found Violet intolerably silly. She cried quite as loudly when she bumped her own head as when Roger applied his most strenuous torments. But what irritated Stephen was the fact that she suspected that Violet almost enjoyed those torments. "He's so dreadfully strong," she had confided in Stephen, with something like pride in her voice. Stephen had longed to shake her for that. "I can pinch quite as hard as he can," she had threatened. "If you think he's stronger than I am, I'll show you." At which Violet had rushed away, screaming. Violet was already full of feminine poses. She loved dolls, but not quite so much as she pretended. People said, "Look at Violet, she's like a little mother." It's so touching to see that instinct in a child. Then Violet would become still more touching. She was always thrusting her dolls upon Stephen, making her undress them and put them to bed. Now you're Nanny, Stephen, and I'm Gertrude's mother, or you can be mother this time if you'd rather. Oh, be careful, you'll break her. Now you've pulled off a button. I do think you might play more like I do." And then Violet knitted, or said that she knitted. Stephen had never seen anything but knots. "Can't you knit?" she would say, looking scornfully at Stephen. "I can. Mother called me a dear little housewife." Then Stephen would lose her temper and speak rudely. "You're a dear little sop, that's what you are." For hours she must play stupid doll games with Violet, because Roger would not always play real games in the garden. He hated to be beaten, yet how could she help it? Could she help throwing straighter than Roger? They had nothing whatever in common, these children, but the Antrams were neighbors, and even Sir Philip, indulgent though he was, insisted that Stephen should have friends of her own age to play with. He had spoken quite sharply on several occasions when the child had pleaded to be allowed to stay at home. Indeed, he spoke sharply that very day at luncheon. "Eat your pudding, please, Stephen, come now, finish it quickly. If all this fuss is about the little Antrams, then father won't have it. It's ridiculous, darling." So Stephen had hastily swallowed her pudding, and escaped upstairs to the nursery. 2. The Antrams lived half a mile from Ledbury, on the other side of the hills. It was quite a long drive to their house from Morton. Stephen was driven over in the dog cart. She sat beside Williams in gloomy silence, with the collar of her coat turned up to her ears. She was filled with a sense of bitter injustice. Why should they insist on this stupid expedition? Even her father had been cross at luncheon because she preferred to stay at home with him. Why should she be forced to know other children? They didn't want her nor she them. And above all, the Antrams. That idiotic Violet who was learning to ride side saddle, and Roger strutting about in his Etons, and bragging, always bragging because he was a boy, and their mother who was quite sure to patronize Stephen, because being grown up made her put on a manner. Stephen could hear her infuriating voice, the voice she reserved for children. "Ah, here you are, Stephen. Now then, little people, run along and have a good feed in the schoolroom. There's plenty of cake." I knew Stephen was coming. We all know Stephen's capacity for cake. Stephen could hear Violet's timorous giggle and Roger's guffaw as they greeted this sally. She could feel his fat fingers pinching her arm, pinching cruelly, slyly, as he strutted beside her. Then his whisper, "You're a pig. You eat much more than I do. Mother said so today, and boys need more than girls." Then Violet, "I'm not very fond of plum cake. It makes me feel sicky. Mother says it's indigestion. I could never eat big bits of plum cake like Stephen. Nanny says I'm a dainty feeder." Then Stephen herself, saying nothing at all, but glaring sideways at Roger. The dog cart was slowly climbing British Camp, that long, steep hill out of Little Malvern. The cold air grew colder, but marvelously pure it was, up there above the valleys. The peak of the camp stood out clearly defined by snow that had fallen lightly that morning, and as they breasted the crest of the hill, the sun shone out on the snow. Away to the right lay the valley of the Wye, a long, lovely valley of deep blue shadows, a valley of small homesteads and mothering trees, of soft undulations and wide, restful spaces leading away to a line of dim mountains, leading away to the mountains of Wales, that lay just over the border. And because she loved this kind English valley, Stephen's sulky eyes must turn and rest upon it. Not all her apprehension and sense of injustice could take from her eyes the joy of that seeing. She must gaze and gaze, she must let it possess her, the peace, the wonder that lay in such beauty, while the unwilling tears welled up under her lids, she not knowing why they had come there. And now they were trotting swiftly downhill. The valley had vanished, but the woods of Eastnor stood naked and lovely, and the forms of their trees were more perfect than forms that are made with hands, unless with the hands of God. Stephen's eyes turned again. She could not stay sulky, for these were the woods where she drove with her father. Twice every spring they drove up to these woods and through them to the stretching parkland beyond. There were deer in the park. They would sometimes get out of the dog cart so that Stephen could feed the does. She began to whistle softly through her teeth, an accomplishment in which she took a great pride. Impossible to go on feeling resentful when the sun was shining between the bare branches, when the air was as clear and as bright as crystal, when the cob was literally flying through the air, taking all Williams's strength to hold him. Steady boy, steady on. He be feeling the weather, gets into his blood and makes him that skittish. Now go quiet, you young blight. Just look at him, will you, he's got himself all of a lather. Let me drive, pleaded Stephen. Oh, please, please Williams. But Williams shook his head as he grinned at her broadly. I've got old bones, Miss Stephen, and old bones breaks quick when it's frosty, so I've heard tell. 3. Mrs. Antrim was waiting for Stephen in the lounge. She was always waiting to waylay her in the lounge, or so it appeared to Stephen. The lounge was a much overdressed apartment, full of small, useless tables and large, clumsy chairs. You bumped into the chairs and tripped over the tables, at least you did if you were Stephen. There was one deadly pitfall you never could avoid, a huge polar bear skin that lay on the floor. Its stuffed head protruded at a most awkward angle. You invariably stubbed your big toe on that head. Stephen, true to tradition, stubbed her toe rather badly as she blundered towards Mrs. Antrim. Dear me, remarked her hostess, you are a great girl. Why, your feet must be double the size of Violet's. Come here and let me have a look at your feet. Then she laughed as though something amused her. Stephen was longing to rub her big toe, but she thought better of it, enduring in silence. Children, called Mrs. Antrim, here's Stephen. I'm sure she's as hungry as a hunter. Violet was wearing a pale blue silk frock. Even at 7 she was vain of her appearance. She had cried until she had got permission to wear that particular pale blue frock, which was usually reserved for parties. Her brown hair was curled into careful ringlets, and tied with a very large bow of blue ribbon. Mrs. Antrim glanced quickly from Stephen to Violet with a look of maternal pride. Roger was bulging inside his Edens. His round cheeks were puffed, very pink and aggressive. He eyed Stephen coldly from above a white collar that was obviously fresh from the laundry. On their way upstairs he pinched Stephen's leg, and Stephen kicked backwards, swiftly and neatly. I suppose you think you can kick? Grunted Roger, who was suffering acutely at that moment from his shin. You've not got the strength of a flea. I don't feel it. At Violet's request they were left alone for tea. She liked playing the hostess, and her mother spoilt her. A special small teapot had to be unearthed, in order that Violet could lift it. Sugar? She inquired with tongs poised in mid-air, and milk? She added, imitating her mother. Mrs. Antrim always said. And milk, in that tone. It made you feel that you must be rather greedy. Oh, chuck it, growled Roger, whose shin was still aching. You know I want milk and 4 lumps of sugar. Violet's underlip began to tremble, but she held her ground with unexpected firmness. May I give you a little more milk, Stephen dear? Or would you prefer no milk, only lemon? There isn't any lemon and you know it, bawled Roger. Here, give me my tea or I'll spoil your hair ribbon. He grabbed at his cup and nearly upset it. Oh, shrilled Violet, my dress. They settled down to the meal at last, but Stephen observed that Roger was watching. Every mouthful she ate she could feel him watching, so that she grew self-conscious. She was hungry, not having eaten much luncheon, but now she could not enjoy her cake. Roger himself was stuffing like a grampus, but his eyes never left her face. Then Roger, the slow-witted in his dealings with Stephen, all but choked in the throes of a great inspiration. I say, you, he began, with his mouth very full, what about a certain young lady out hunting? What about a fat leg on each side of her horse like a monkey on a stick, and everybody laughing? They were not, exclaimed Stephen, growing suddenly red. Oh, yes, but they were, though, mocked Roger. Now had Stephen been wise she would have let the thing drop, for no fun is derived from a one-sided contest, but at 8 years old one is not always wise, and moreover her pride had been stung to the quick. She said, I'd like to see you get the brush, why you can't stick on just riding round the paddock. I've seen you fall off jumping nothing but a hurdle, I'd like to see you out hunting. Roger swallowed some more cake. There was now no great hurry, he had thrown his sprat and had landed his mackerel. He had very much feared that she might not be drawn. It was not always easy to draw Stephen. Well now, listen, he drawled, and I'll tell you something. You thought they admired you squatting on your pony. You thought you were being very grand, I'll bet, with your new riding breeches and your black velvet cap. You thought they'd suppose that you looked like a boy, just because you were trying to be one. As a matter of fact, if you really want to know, they were busting their sides. Why, my father said so. He was laughing all the time at your looking so funny on that rotten old pony that's as fat as a porpoise. Why, he only gave you the brush for fun, because you were such a small kid, he said so. He said, I gave Stephen Gordon the brush because I thought she might cry if I didn't. You're a liar, breathed Stephen, who had turned very pale. Oh, am I? Well, you ask father. Do stop, whimpered Violet, beginning to cry. You're horrid, you're spoiling my party. But Roger was launched on his first perfect triumph. He had seen the expression in Stephen's eyes. And my mother said, he continued more loudly, that your mother must be funny to allow you to do it. She said it was horrid to let girls ride that way. She said she was awfully surprised at your mother. She said that she'd have thought that your mother had more sense. She said that it wasn't modest, she said. Stephen had suddenly sprung to her feet. How dare you? How dare you, my mother? She spluttered. And now she was almost beside herself with rage, conscious only of one overwhelming impulse, and that to belabor Roger. A plate crashed to the ground and Violet screamed faintly. Roger, in his turn, had pushed back his chair. His round eyes were staring and rather frightened. He had never seen Stephen quite like this before. She was actually rolling up the sleeves of her smock. You cad, she shouted, I'll fight you for this. And she doubled up her fist and shook it at Roger while he edged away from the table. She stood there an enraged and ridiculous figure in her Liberty smock, with her hard, boyish forearms. Her long hair had partly escaped from its ribbon, and the bow sagged down limply, crooked and foolish. All that was heavy in her face sprang into view, the strong line of the jaw, the square, massive brow, the eyebrows, too thick and too wide for beauty. And yet there was a kind of large splendor about her. Absurd though she was splendid at that moment, grotesque and splendid, like some primitive thing conceived in a turbulent age of transition. Are you going to fight me, you coward? She demanded, as she stepped round the table and faced her tormentor. But Roger thrust his hands deep into his pockets, I don't fight with girls," he remarked very grandly. Then he sauntered out of the schoolroom. Stephen's own hands fell and hung at her sides, her head drooped, and she stood staring down at the carpet. The whole of her suddenly drooped and looked helpless, as she stood staring down at the carpet. "How could you?" began Violet, who was plucking up courage. "Little girls don't have fights. I don't. I'd be frightened." But Stephen cut her short. "I'm going," she said thickly, "I'm going home to my father." She went heavily downstairs and out into the lobby, where she put on her hat and coat. Then she made her way round the house to the stables, in search of old Williams and the dog cart. "You're home very early, Stephen," said Anna, but Sir Philip was staring at his daughter's face. "What's the matter?" he inquired, and his voice sounded anxious. "Come here and tell me about it." Then Stephen quite suddenly burst into tears, and she wept as she stood there before them, and she poured out her shame and humiliation, telling all that Roger had said about her mother, telling all that she, Stephen, would have done to defend her, had it not been that Roger would not fight with a girl. She wept without any restraint, scarcely knowing what she said, at that moment not caring. And Sir Philip listened with his head on his hand, and Anna listened bewildered and dumbfounded. She tried to kiss Stephen, to hold her to her, but Stephen, still sobbing, pushed her away. In this orgy of grief she resented consolation, so that in the end Anna took her to the nursery and delivered her over to the care of Mrs. Bingham, feeling that the child did not want her. When Anna went quietly back to the study, Sir Philip was still sitting with his head on his hand. She said, "It's time you realized, Philip, that if you're Stephen's father, I'm her mother. So far you've managed the child your own way, and I don't think it's been successful. You've treated Stephen as though she were a boy. Perhaps it's because I've not given you a son." Her voice trembled a little, but she went on gravely. "It's not good for Stephen. I know it's not good, and at times it frightens me, Philip." "No, no," he said sharply. But Anna persisted. "Yes, Philip, at times it makes me afraid. I can't tell you why, but it seems all wrong. It makes me feel strange with the child." He looked at her out of his melancholy eyes. "Can't you trust me? Won't you try to trust me, Anna?" But Anna shook her head. "I don't understand. Why shouldn't you trust me, Philip?" And then in his terror for this well-beloved woman, Sir Philip committed the first cowardly action of his life. He who would not have spared himself pain, could not bear to inflict it on Anna. In his infinite pity for Stephen's mother, he sinned very deeply and gravely against Stephen, by withholding from that mother his own conviction that her child was not as other children. "There's nothing for you to understand," he said firmly, "but I like you to trust me in all things." After this they sat talking about the child, Sir Philip very quiet and reassuring. "I've wanted her to have a healthy body," he explained, "that's why I've let her run more or less wild. But perhaps we'd better have a governess now. As you say, a French governess, my dear, if you'd prefer one. Later on I've always meant to engage a bluestocking, some woman who's been to Oxford. I want Stephen to have the finest education that care and money can give her." But once again Anna began to protest. "What's the good of it all for a girl?" she argued. "Did you love me any less because I couldn't do mathematics? Do you love me less now because I count on my fingers?" He kissed her. "That's different, you're you," he said, smiling, but a look that she knew well had come into his eyes, a cold, resolute expression, which meant that all persuasion was likely to be unavailing. Presently they went upstairs to the nursery, and Sir Philip shaded the candle with his hand, While they stood together gazing down at Stephen, the child was heavily asleep. "Look, Philip," whispered Anna, pitiful and shaken. "Look, Philip, she's got 2 big tears on her cheek." He nodded, slipping his arm around Anna. "Come away," he muttered, "we may wake her." Chapter 6. 1. Mrs. Bingham departed unmourned and unmourning, and in her stead reigned Mademoiselle Dupont, a youthful French governess with a long, pleasant face that reminded Stephen of a horse. This equine resemblance was fortunate in one way. Stephen took to Mademoiselle Dupont at once, but it did not make for respectful obedience. On the contrary, Stephen felt very familiar, kindly familiar and quite at her ease. She petted Mademoiselle Dupont. Mademoiselle Dupont was lonely and homesick, and it must be admitted that she liked being petted. Stephen would rush off to get her a cushion, or a footstool or her glass of milk at 11. Comme elle est gentille, cette drôle de petite fille, elle a si bon cœur, would think Mademoiselle Dupont, and somehow geography would not seem to matter quite so much, or arithmetic either. In vain did Mademoiselle try to be strict, her pupil could always beguile her. Mademoiselle Dupont knew nothing about horses, in spite of the fact that she looked so much like one, and Stephen would complacently entertain her with long conversations anent splints and spavins, cowhocks and colic, all mixed up together in a kind of wild veterinary jumble. Had Williams been listening, he might well have rubbed his chin, but Williams was not there to listen. As for Mademoiselle Dupont, she was genuinely impressed. Mais quel type, quel type. She was always exclaiming, "Vous êtes déjà une vraie petite Amazone, Stephen." "N'est-ce pas?" agreed Stephen, who was picking up French. The child showed a real ability for French, and this delighted her teacher. At the end of 6 months she could gabble quite freely, making quick little gestures and shrugging her shoulders. She liked talking French, it rather amused her, nor was she averse to mastering the grammar. What she could not endure were the long, foolish dictées from the edifying Bibliothèque Rose. Weak in all other respects with Stephen, Mademoiselle Dupont clung to these dictées. The Bibliothèque Rose became her last trench of authority, and she held it. "Les petites filles modèles," Mademoiselle would announce, while Stephen yawned out her ineffable boredom. "Maintenant nous allons retrouver Sophie, where did we arrive?" "Ah, oui, I remember. Cette preuve de confiance touches Sophie et augmente encore son regret d'avoir été si méchante. Comment, c'est dit-elle, ai-je pu me livrer à un tel école? Comment ai-je été si méchante avec des amis aussi bons que celles que j'ai ici, et si hardy envers une personne aussi douce, aussi tendre que me?" De Fleurville. Single quote. From time to time the program would be varied by extracts of an even more edifying nature, and les bons enfants would be chosen for dictation, to the scorn and derision of Stephen. La maman. D'un Louis ton cœur, mon Henri, c'est ce que tu pourras lui donner de plus agréable. Mon cœur. Dit Henri en déboutonnant son habit et en ouvrant sa chemise. Mais comment faire? Il me faudrait un couteau. At which Stephen would giggle. One day she had added a comment of her own in the margin. Little beast, he was only shamming. And Mademoiselle, coming on this unawares, had been caught in the act of laughing by her pupil. After which there was naturally less discipline than ever in the schoolroom, but considerably more friendship. However, Anna seemed quite contented, since Stephen was becoming so proficient in French, and observing that his wife looked less anxious these days, Sir Philip said nothing, biding his time. This frank, jaunty slacking on the part of his daughter should be checked later on, he decided. Meanwhile, Stephen grew fond of the mild-faced Frenchwoman, who in her turn adored the unusual child. She would often confide her troubles to Stephen, those family troubles in which governesses abound. Her maman was old and delicate and needy, her sister had a wicked and spendthrift husband, and now her sister must make little bags for the grand shops in Paris that paid very badly. Her sister was gradually losing her eyesight through making those little bead bags for the shops that cared nothing, and paid very badly. Mademoiselle sent maman a part of her earnings, and sometimes, of course, she must help her sister. Her maman must have her chicken on Sundays. Bon Dieu, il faut vivre, il faut manger, au moins. And afterwards the chicken came in very nicely for Petite Marmite, which was made from his carcass and a few leaves of cabbage. Maman loved Petite Marmite, the warmth of it eased her old gums. Stephen would listen to these long dissertations with patience and with apparent understanding. She would nod her head wisely. Mais c'est dur, she would comment, c'est terriblement dur, la vie. But she never confided her own special troubles, and Mademoiselle Dupont sometimes wondered about her. Est-elle heureuse, cet étrange petit être? She would wonder. Sera-t-elle heureuse plus tard? Qui sait? 2. Idleness and peace had reigned in the schoolroom for more than 2 years, when ex-Sergeant Smiley sailed over the horizon and proceeded to announce that he taught gymnastics and fencing. From that moment peace ceased to reign in the schoolroom, or indeed anywhere in the house for that matter. In vain did Mademoiselle Dupont protest that gymnastics and fencing thickened the ankles. In vain did Anna express disapproval. Stephen merely ignored them and consulted her father. "I want to go in for sandoing," she informed him, as though they were discussing a career. He laughed. "Sandoing? Well, and how will you start it?" Then Stephen explained about ex-Sergeant Smiley. "I see," nodded Sir Philip, "you want to learn fencing." "And how to lift weights with my stomach," she said quickly. "Why not with your large front teeth?" he teased her. "Oh, well," he added, "there's no harm in fencing or gymnastics either, provided, of course, that you don't try to wreck Morton Hall like a Samson wrecking the house of the Philistines. I foresee that might easily happen." Stephen grinned. "But it mightn't if I cut off my hair." "May I cut off my hair?" "Oh, do let me, father." "Certainly not. I prefer to risk it," said Sir Philip, speaking quite firmly. Stephen went pounding back to the schoolroom. "I'm going to those classes," she announced in triumph. "I'm going to be driven over to Malvern next week. I'm going to begin on Tuesday, and I'm going to learn fencing so as I can kill your brother-in-law who's a beast to your sister. I'm going to fight duels for wives in distress, like men do in Paris, and I'm going to learn how to lift pianos on my stomach by expanding something, the diapan muscles, and I'm going to cut my hair off," she mendaciously concluded, glancing sideways to observe the effect of this bombshell. "Bon Dieu, soyez clément," breathed Mademoiselle Dupont, casting her eyes to heaven. It was not very long before ex-Sergeant Smiley discovered that in Stephen he had a star pupil. "Some day you ought to make a champion fencer, if you work really hard at it, miss," he told her. Stephen did not learn to lift pianos with her stomach, but as time went on she did become quite an expert gymnast and fencer, and as Mademoiselle Dupont confided to Anna, it was after all very charming to watch her, so supple and young and quick in her movements. "And she fence like an angel," said Mademoiselle fondly. "She fence now almost as well as she ride." Anna nodded. She herself had seen Stephen fencing many times, and had thought it a fine performance for so young a child, but the fencing displeased her, so that she found it hard to praise Stephen. I hate all that sort of thing for girls, she said slowly. But she fence like a man, with such power and such grace, babbled Mademoiselle Dupat, the tactless. And now life was full of new interest for Stephen, an interest that centered entirely in her body. She discovered her body for a thing to be cherished, a thing of real value since its strength could rejoice her, and young though she was she cared for her body with great diligence, bathing it night and morning in dull, tepid water. Cold baths were forbidden, and hot baths, she had heard, sometimes weakened the muscles. For gymnastics she wore her hair in a pigtail, and somehow that pigtail began to intrude on other occasions. In spite of protests, she always forgot and came down to breakfast with a neat, shining play, so that Anna gave in the end and said, sighing, "Have your pigtail do, child, if you feel that you must, but I can't say it suits you, Stephen." And Mademoiselle Dupat was foolishly loving. Stephen would stop in the middle of lessons to roll back her sleeves and examine her muscles. Then Mademoiselle Dupat, instead of protesting, would laugh and admire her absurd little biceps. Stephen's craze for physical culture increased, and now it began to invade the schoolroom. Dumbbells appeared in the schoolroom bookcases, while half-worn-out gym shoes skulked in the corners. Everything went by the board but this passion of the child's for training her body. And what must Sir Philip elect to do next, but to write out to Ireland and purchase a hunter for his daughter to ride, a real, thoroughbred hunter? And what must he say but, "That's one for young Roger"? So that Stephen found herself comfortably laughing at the thought of young Roger, and that laugh went a long way towards healing the wound that had rankled within her. Perhaps this was why Sir Philip had ridden out to Ireland for that thoroughbred hunter. The hunter, when he came, was grey-coated and slender, and his eyes were as soft as an Irish morning, and his courage was as bright as an Irish sunrise, and his heart was as young as the wild heart of Ireland, but devoted and loyal and eager for service, and his name was sweet on the tongue as you spoke. It, being Raftery, after the poet. Stephen loved Raftery and Raftery loved Stephen. It was love at first sight, and they talked to each other for hours in his loose box, not in Irish or English, but in a quiet language having very few words but many small sounds and many small movements, which to both of them meant more than words. And Raftery said, "I will carry you bravely, I will serve you all the days of my life." And she answered, "I will care for you night and day, Raftery, all the days of your life." Thus Stephen and Raftery pledged their devotion, alone in his fragrant, hay-scented stable. And Raftery was 5 and Stephen was 12 when they solemnly pledged their devotion. Never was rider more proud or more happy than Stephen, when first she and Raftery went a-hunting, and never was youngster more wise or courageous than Raftery proved himself at his fences, and never can Bellerophon have thrilled to more daring than did Stephen, astride of Raftery that day, with the wind in her face and a fire in her heart that made life a thing of glory. At the very beginning of the run the fox turned in the direction of Morton, actually crossing the big north paddock before turning once more and making for Upton. In the paddock was a mighty, upstanding hedge, a formidable place concealing timber, and what must they do, these two young creatures, but go straight at it and get safely over? Those who saw Raftery fly that hedge could never afterwards doubt his valor. And when they got home there was Anna waiting to pat Raftery, because she could not resist him. Because, being Irish, her hands loved the feel of fine horseflesh under their delicate fingers, and because she did very much want to be tender to Stephen, and understanding. But as Stephen dismounted, bespattered and dishevelled, and yet with that perversive look of her father, the words that Anna had been planning to speak died away before they could get themselves spoken. She shrank back from the child, but the child was too overjoyed at that moment to perceive it. 4. Happy days, splendid days of childish achievements, but they passed all too soon, giving place to the seasons, and there came the winter when Stephen was 14. On a January afternoon of bright sunshine, Mademoiselle Dupont sat dabbing her eyes, for Mademoiselle Dupont must leave her loved Stephen, must give place to a rival who could teach Greek and Latin. She would go back to Paris, the poor Mademoiselle Dupont, and take care of her aging maman. Meanwhile, Stephen, very angular and lanky at 14, was standing before her father in his study. She stood still, but her glance kept straying to the window, to the sunshine that seemed to be beckoning through the window. She was dressed for riding in breeches and gaiters, and her thoughts were with Raftery. "Sit down," said Sir Philip, and his voice was so grave that her thoughts came back with a leap and a bound. "You and I have got to talk this thing out, Stephen." "What thing, father?" she faltered, sitting down abruptly. "Your idleness, my child. The time has now come when all play and no work will make a dull Stephen, unless we pull ourselves together." She rested her large, shapely hands on her knees and bent forward, searching his face intently. What she saw there was a quiet determination that spread from his lips to his eyes. She grew suddenly uneasy, like a youngster who objects to the rather unpleasant process of mouthing. "I speak French," she broke out. "I speak French like a native. I can read and write French as well as Mademoiselle does." "And beyond that you know very little," he informed her. "It's not enough, Stephen, believe me." There ensued a long silence, she tapping her leg with her whip, he speculating about her. Then he said, but quite gently, "I've considered this thing, I've considered this matter of your education. I want you to have the same education, the same advantages as I'd give to my son. That is as far as possible," he added, looking away from Stephen. "But I'm not your son, father," she said very slowly, and even as she said it her heart felt heavy and sad as it had not done for years, not since she was quite a small child. And at this he looked back at her with love in his eyes, love and something that seemed like compassion, and their looks met and mingled and held for a moment, speechless yet somehow expressing their hearts. Her own eyes clouded and she stared at her boots, ashamed of the tears that she felt might flow over. He saw this and went on speaking more quickly, as though anxious to cover her confusion. "You're all the son that I've got," he told her. "You're brave and strong-limbed, but I want you to be wise. I want you to be wise for your own sake, Stephen, because at the best life requires great wisdom. I want you to learn to make friends of your books. Someday you may need them, because," he hesitated, "because you mayn't find life at all easy, we none of us do, and books are good friends. I don't want you to give up your fencing and gymnastics or your riding, but I want you to show moderation. You've developed your body, now develop your mind. Let your mind and your muscles help, not hinder each other. It can be done, Stephen, I've done it myself, and in many respects you're like me. I've brought you up very differently from most girls, you must know that. Look at Violet Antrim. I've indulged you, I suppose, but I don't think I've spoilt you, because I believe in you absolutely. I believe in myself too, where you're concerned, I believe in my own sound judgment. But you've now got to prove that my judgment's been sound, we've both got to prove it to ourselves and to your mother. She's been very patient with my unusual methods. I'm going to stand trial now, and she'll be my judge. Help me, I'm going to need all your help. If you fail then I fail, we shall go down together. But we're not going to fail, you're going to work hard when your new governess comes, and when you're older you're going to become a fine woman. You must, dear, I love you so much that you can't disappoint me." His voice faltered a little, then he held out his hand. "And Stephen, come here, look me straight in the eyes. What is honor, my daughter?" She looked into his anxious, questioning eyes. "Your honor," she said quite simply. 5. When Stephen kissed Mademoiselle Dupat goodbye, she cried, for she felt that something was going that would never come back. Irresponsible childhood. It was going, like Mademoiselle Dupat. Kind Mademoiselle Dupat, so foolishly loving, so easily coerced, so glad to be persuaded, so eager to believe that you were doing your best, in the face of the most obvious slacking. Kind Mademoiselle Dupat, who smiled when she shouldn't, who laughed when she shouldn't, and now she was weeping, but weeping as only a Latin can weep, shedding rivers of tears and sobbing quite loudly. Cherry, mon bébé, petit cho. She was sobbing, as she clung to the angular Stephen. The tears ran down onto Mademoiselle's tippet, and they wet the poor fur which already looked jaded, and the fur clogged together, turning black with those tears, so that Mademoiselle tried to wipe it. But the more she wiped it the wetter it grew, since her handkerchief only augmented the trouble, nor was Stephen's large handkerchief very dry either, as she found when she started to help. The old station fly that had come out from Malvern drove up, and the footman seized Mademoiselle's luggage. It was such meager luggage that he waved back assistance from the driver, and lifted the trunk single-handed. Then Mademoiselle Dupat broke out into English, heaven only knew why, perhaps from emotion. "It's not farewell, it shall not be forever," she sobbed. "You come, but I feel it, to Paris. We meet once more, Stephen, my poor little baby, when you grow up bigger, we two meet once more," and Stephen, already taller than she was, longed to grow small again, just to please Mademoiselle. Then, because the French are a practical people even in moments of real emotion, Mademoiselle found her handbag, and groping in its depths she produced a half-sheet of paper. "The address of my sister in Paris," she said, snuffling, "the address of my sister who makes little bags. If you should hear of anyone, Stephen, any lady who would care to buy one little bag." "Yes, yes, I'll remember," muttered Stephen. At last she was gone. The fly rumbled away down the drive and finally turned the corner. To the end a wet face had been thrust from the window, a wet handkerchief waved despondently at Stephen. The rain must have mingled with Mademoiselle's tears, for the weather had broken and now it was raining. It was surely a desolate day for departure, with the mist closing over the Severn Valley and beginning to creep up the hillsides. Stephen made her way to the empty schoolroom, empty of all save a general confusion, the confusion that stalks in some people's trail. It had always stalked Mademoiselle Dupat. On the chairs, which stood crooked, lay odds and ends meaning nothing, crumpled paper, a broken shoehorn, a well-worn brown glove that had lost its fellow and likewise two of its buttons. On the table lay a much abused pink blotting pad, from which Stephen had torn off the corners. Unchidden, it was crossed and recrossed with elegant French script until its scarred face had turned purple. And there stood the bottle of purple ink, half empty, and green round its neck with dribbles, and a pen with a nib as sharp as a pin point, a thin, peevish nib that jabbed at the paper. Chock a block with the bottle of purple ink lay a little piety card of Saint Joseph that had evidently slipped out of Mademoiselle's missal street. Joseph looked very respectable and kind, like the fishmonger in Great Malvern. Stephen picked up the card and stared at Saint Joseph. Something was written across his corner. Looking closer she read the minute handwriting, "Prise pour ma petite Stephen." She put the card away in her desk. the ink and the blotter she hid in the cupboard together with the peevish steel nib that jabbed paper, and that richly deserved cremation. Then she straightened the chairs and threw away the litter, after which she went in search of a duster. One by one she dusted the few remaining volumes in the bookcase, including the bibliothèque rose. She arranged her dictation notebooks in a pile with others that were far less accurately written, books of sums, mostly careless and marked with a cross, books of English history, in one of which Stephen had begun to write the history of the horse. Books of geography with Mademoiselle's comments in strong purple ink, Grand Manqué detention. And lastly she collected the torn lesson books that had lain on their backs, on their sides, on their bellies, anyhow, anywhere in drawers or in cupboards, but not very often in the bookcase. For the bookcase was harboring quite other things, a motley and most unstudious collection, dumbbells, wooden and iron, of varying sizes, some Indian clubs, one split off at the handle, cotton laces, for Jim's shoes, the belt of a tunic. And then stable keepsakes, including a headband that Raftery had worn on some special occasion, a miniature horseshoe kicked sky high by Collins, a half-eaten carrot, now withered and moldy, and 2 hunting crops that had both lost their lashes and were waiting to visit the saddler. Stephen considered, rubbing her chin, a habit which by now had become automatic. She finally decided on the ample box sofa as a seemly receptacle. Remained only the carrot, and she stood for a long time with it clasped in her hand, disturbed and unhappy. This clearing of decks for stern mental action was certainly very depressing. But at last she threw the thing into the fire, where it shifted distressfully, sizzling and humming. Then she sat down and stared rather grimly at the flames that were burning up Raftery's first carrot. Chapter 7. 1. Soon after the departure of Mademoiselle Duphot, there occurred 2 distinct innovations at Morton. Miss Puddleton arrived to take possession of the schoolroom, and Sir Philip bought himself a motor car. The motor was a Panhard, and it caused much excitement in the neighborhood of Upton-on-Severn. Conservative, suspicious of all innovations, people had abstained from motors in the Midlands, and, incredible as it now seems to look back on, Sir Philip was regarded as a kind of pioneer. The Panhard was a high-shouldered, snub-nosed abortion with a loud, vulgar voice and an uncertain temper. It suffered from frequent fits of dyspepsia, brought about by an unhealthy spark plug. Its seats were the very acme of discomfort, its primitive gears unhandy and noisy, but nevertheless it could manage to attain to a speed of about 15 miles per hour, given always that, by God's good grace and the chauffeur's, it was not in the throes of indigestion. Anna felt doubtful regarding this new purchase. She was one of those women who, having passed 40, were content to go on placidly driving in their broughams, or, in summer, in their charming little French Victorias. She detested the look of herself in large goggles, detested being forced to tie on her hat, detested the heavy, mannish coat of rough tweed that Sir Philip insisted she must wear when motoring. Such things were not of her. They offended her sense of the seemly, her preference for soft, clinging garments, her instinct for quiet, rather slow, gentle movements, her love of the feminine and comely. For Anna at 44 was still slender, and her dark hair, as yet, was untouched with gray, and her blue Irish eyes were as clear and candid as when she had come as a bride to Morton. She was beautiful still, and this fact rejoiced her in secret, because of her husband. Yet Anna did not ignore middle age, she met it halfway with dignity and courage, and now her soft dresses were of reticent colors, and her movements a little more careful than they had been, and her mind more severely disciplined and guarded, too much guarded these days. She was gradually growing less tolerant as her interests narrowed. And the motor, an unimportant thing in itself, served nevertheless to crystallize in Anna a certain tendency towards retrogression, a certain instinctive dislike of the unusual, a certain deep-rooted fear of the unknown. Old Williams was openly disgusted and hostile. He considered the car to be an outrage to his stables, those immaculate stables with their spacious coach houses, their wide plates of straw neatly interwoven with yards of red and blue saddler's tape, and their fine stable yard hitherto kept so spotless. Came the Panhard, and behold, pools of oil on the flagstones, greenish, bad-smelling oil that defied even scouring, and a medley of odd-looking tools in the coach house, all greasy, all soiling your hands when you touched them, and large tins of what looked like black Vaseline, and spare tires for which nails had been knocked into the woodwork, and a bench with a vise for the motors insides which were frequently being dissected. From this coach house the dog cart had been ruthlessly expelled, and now it must stand chock-a-block with the phaeton, so that room might be made for the garish intruder together with its young body-servant. The young body-servant was known as a chauffeur. He had come down from London and wore clothes made of leather. He talked Cockney, and openly spat before Williams in the coach house, then rubbed his foot over the spittle. All, avenue none of expectoration, in me coach house, I tells ee. Bawled Williams, apoplectic with temper. Oh, come orf it, do, grandpa, we're not in the ark, was how the new blood answered Williams. There was war to the knife between Williams and Burton who expressed large disdain of the horses. Time's up now, grandpa, he was constantly remarking, it's all up with the geese, better learn to be a chauffeur. Opes I'll die afore ever I demean myself that way, you young blight. Bawled the outraged Williams. Very angry he grew, and his dinner fermented, dilating his stomach and causing discomfort, so that his wife became anxious about him. Now don't ye go worryin', Arth tour, she coaxed, is be old, me and you, and the world be progressin'. It be goin' to the devil, that's what it be doin'. Groaned Williams, rubbing his stomach. To make matters worse, Sir Philip's behavior was that of a schoolboy with some horrid new contraption. He was caught by his stud groom lying flat on his back with his feet sticking out beneath the bonnet of the motor, and when he emerged there was soot on his cheekbones, on his hair, and even on the tip of his nose. He looked terribly sheepish, and as Williams said later to his wife, "It were somethin' awful to see. I am all mucked up, and I am such a neat gentleman, and I am in a filthy old coat of that Burton's, and that Burton a grinnin' at me and just pointin', silent, because the master couldn't see, I am, and the master a callin' up familiar like to Burton, I say, she's got somethin' all wrong with exhaust pipe. And Burton a contradictin' the master, it's that piston, says as cool as please." Nor was Stephen less thrilled by the car than was her father. Stephen made friends with the execrable Burton, and Burton, who was only too anxious to gain allies, soon started to teach her the parts of the engine. He taught her to drive too, Sir Philip being willing, and off they would go, the three of them together, leaving Williams to glare at the disappearing motor. And, such a fine, 'orse woman and all, he would grumble, rubbing a disconsolate chin. It is not too much to say that Williams felt heartbroken. He was like a very unhappy old baby, quite infantile he was in his fits of bad temper, in his mouthings and his grindings of toothless gums. And all about nothing, for Sir Philip and his daughter had the lure of horseflesh in their very bones. And then there was Raftery, and Raftery loved Stephen, and Stephen loved Raftery. 2. The motoring, of course, was the most tremendous fun, and it was a very large but indeed, When Stephen got home to Morton and the schoolroom, a little gray figure would be sitting at the table correcting an exercise book, or preparing some task for the following morning. The little gray figure might look up and smile, and when it did this its face would be charming, but if it refrained from smiling, then its face would be ugly, too hard and too square in formation, except for the brow, which was rounded and shiny like a bare intellectual knee. If the little gray figure got up from the table, you were struck by the fact that it seemed square all over, square shoulders, square hips, a flat, square line of bosom, square tips to the fingers, square toes to the shoes, and all tiny. It suggested a miniature box that was neatly spliced at the corners. Of uncertain age, pale, with iron gray hair, gray eyes, and invariably dressed in dark gray, Miss Puddleton did not look very inspiring, not at all as one having authority, in fact. But on close observation it had to be admitted that her chin, though minute, was extremely aggressive. Her mouth, too, was firm, except when its firmness was melted by the warmth and humor of her smile, a smile that mocked, pitied and questioned the world, and perhaps Miss Puddleton as well. From the very first moment of Miss Puddleton's arrival, Stephen had had an uncomfortable conviction that this queer little woman was going to mean something, was going to become a fixture. And sure enough she had settled down at once, so that in less than 2 months it seemed to Stephen that Miss Puddleton must always have been at Morton, must always have been sitting at the large walnut table, must always have been saying in that dry, toneless voice with the Oxford accent, "You've forgotten something, Stephen," and then, "The books can't walk to the bookcase, but you can, so suppose that you take them with you." It was truly amazing, the change in the schoolroom, not a book out of place, not a shelf in disorder. Even the box lounge had had to be opened and its dumb-bells and clubs paired off nicely together. Miss Puddleton always liked things to be paired, perhaps an unrecognized matrimonial instinct. And now Stephen found herself put into harness for the first time in her life, and she loathed the sensation. There were so many rules that a very large time-sheet had had to be fastened to the blackboard in the schoolroom. "Because," said Miss Puddleton as she pinned the thing up, "even my brain won't stand your complete lack of method. It's infectious, this time-sheet is my antitoxin, so please don't tear it to pieces." Mathematics and algebra, Latin and Greek, Roman history, Greek history, geometry, botany, they reduced Stephen's mind to a species of beehive in which every bee buzzed on the least provocation. She would gaze at Miss Puddleton in a kind of amazement, that tiny, square box to hold all this grim knowledge. And seeing that gaze Miss Puddleton would smile her most warm, charming smile, and would say as she did so, "Yes, I know, but it's only the first effort, Stephen. Presently your mind will get neat like the schoolroom, and then you'll be able to find what you want without all this rummaging and bother." But her tasks being over, Stephen must often slip away to visit Raftery in the stables. "Oh, Raftery, I'm hating it so," she would tell him. "I feel like you'd feel if I put you in harness, hard wooden shafts and a kicking strap, Raftery, but my darling, I'd never put you into harness." And Raftery would hardly know what he should answer, since all human creatures, so far as he knew them, must run between shafts. Godlike though they were, they undoubtedly had to run between shafts. Nothing but Stephen's great love for her father helped her to endure the first 6 months of learning, that in her own stubborn, arrogant will that made her hate to be beaten. She would swing clubs and dumb-bells in a kind of fury, consoling herself with the thought of her muscles, and, finding her at it, Miss Puddleton had laughed. "You must feel that your teacher's some sort of midge, Stephen, a tiresome midge that you want to brush off." Then Stephen had laughed too. Well, you were little, Puddle. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mind, Miss Puddleton had told her. Call me Puddle if you like, it's all one to me. After which Miss Puddleton disappeared somehow, and Puddle took her place in the household. An insignificant creature this Puddle, yet at moments unmistakably self-assertive. Always willing to help in domestic affairs, such as balancing Anna's chaotic account books, or making out library lists for Jackson's, she was nevertheless very guardful of her rights, very quick to assert and maintain her position. Puddle knew what she wanted and saw that she got it, both in and out of the schoolroom. Yet everyone liked her. She took what she gave and she gave what she took, yes, but sometimes she gave just a little bit more. And that little bit more is the whole art of teaching, the whole art of living, in fact, and Miss Puddleton knew it. Thus gradually, oh, very gradually at first, she wore down her pupils' unconscious resistance. With small, dexterous fingers she caught Stephen's brain, and she stroked it and modeled it after her own fashion. She talked to that brain and showed it new pictures, she gave it new thoughts, new hopes and ambitions, she made it feel certain and proud of achievement. Nor did she belittle Stephen's muscles in the process, never once did Puddle make game of the athlete, never once did she show by so much as the twitch of an eyelid that she had her own thoughts about her pupil. She appeared to take Stephen as a matter of course, nothing surprised or even amused her it seemed, and Stephen grew quite at ease with her. I can always be comfortable with you, Puddle, Stephen would say in a tone of satisfaction. You're like a nice chair. Though you are so tiny yet one's got room to stretch, I don't know how you do it. Then Puddle would smile, and that smile would warm Stephen while it mocked her a little, but it also mocked Puddle. They would share that warm smile with its fun and its kindness, so that neither of them could feel hurt or embarrassed. And their friendship took root, growing strong and verdant, and it flourished like a green bay tree in the schoolroom. Came the time when Stephen began to realize that Puddle had genius, the genius of teaching, the genius of compelling her pupil to share in her own enthusiastic love of the classics. Oh, Stephen, if only you could read this in Greek, she would say, and her voice would sound full of excitement. The beauty, the splendid dignity of it. It's like the sea, Stephen, rather terrible but splendid. That's the language, it's far more virile than Latin. And Stephen would catch that sudden excitement, and determine to work even harder at Greek. But Puddle did not live by the ancients alone, she taught Stephen to appreciate all literary beauty, observing in her pupil a really fine judgment, a great feeling for balance in sentences and words. A vast tract of new interest was thus opened up, and Stephen began to excel in composition. To her own deep amazement she found herself able to write many things that had long lain dormant in her heart. All the beauty of nature, for instance, she could write it. Impressions of childhood, gold light on the hills, the first cuckoo, mysterious, strangely alluring, those rides home from hunting together with her father, bare furrows, the meaning of those bare furrows. And later, how many queer hopes and queer longings, queer joys and even more curious frustrations. Joy of strength, splendid physical strength and courage, joy of health and sound sleep and refreshed awakening, joy of Raftery leaping under the saddle, joy of wind racing backward as Raftery leapt forward. And then, what? A sudden impenetrable darkness, a sudden vast void, all nothingness and darkness, a sudden sense of acute apprehension. I'm lost, where am I? Where am I? I'm nothing, yes I am, I'm Stephen, but that's being nothing, then that horrible sense of apprehension. Writing, it was like a heavenly balm, it was like the flowing out of deep waters, It was like the lifting of a load from the spirit. It brought with it a sense of relief, of assuagement. One could say things in writing without feeling self-conscious, without feeling shy and ashamed and foolish. One could even write of the days of young Nelson, smiling a very little as one did so. Sometimes Puddle would sit alone in her bedroom reading and rereading Stephen's strange compositions, frowning, or smiling a little in her turn, at those turbulent, youthful outpourings. She would think, here's real talent, real red-hot talent, interesting to find it in that great, athletic creature, but what is she likely to make of her talent? She's up agin the world, if she only knew it. Then Puddle would shake her head and look doubtful, feeling sorry for Stephen and the world in general. Point 3. This then was how Stephen conquered yet another kingdom, and at 17 was not only athlete but student. 3 years under Puddle's ingenious tuition, and the girl was as proud of her brains as of her muscles, a trifle too proud. She was growing conceited, she was growing self-satisfied, arrogant even, and Sir Philip must tease her. Ask Stephen, she'll tell us. Stephen, what's that reference to Adeimantus? Something about a mind fixed on true being. Doesn't it come in Euripides, somewhere? Oh, no, I'm forgetting. Of course it's Plato. Really my Greek is disgracefully rusty. Then Stephen would know that Sir Philip was laughing at her, but very kindly. In spite of her newly acquired book learning, Stephen still talked quite often to Raftery. He was now 10 years old and had grown much in wisdom himself, so he listened with care and attention. You see, she would tell him, it's very important to develop the brain as well as the muscles. I'm now doing both. Stand still, will you, Raftery? Never mind that old corn bin. Stop rolling your eye round. It's very important to develop the brain because that gives you an advantage over people. It makes you more able to do as you like in this world, to conquer conditions, Raftery. And Raftery, who was not really thinking of the corn bin, but rolling his eye in an effort to answer, would want to say something too big for his language, which at best must consist of small sounds and small movements, would want to say something about a strong feeling he had that Stephen was missing the truth. But how could he hope to make her understand the age-old wisdom of all the dumb creatures? The wisdom of plains and primeval forests, the wisdom come down from the youth of the world. Chapter 8. 1. At 17 Stephen was taller than Anna, who had used to be considered quite tall for a woman, but Stephen was nearly as tall as her father, not a beauty this, in the eyes of the neighbors. Colonel Antrim would shake his head and remark, I like 'em plump and compact, it's more taking. Then his wife, who was certainly plump and compact, so compact in her stays that she felt rather breathless, would say, but then Stephen is very unusual, almost a wee bit unnatural. Such a pity, poor child, it's a terrible drawback. Young men do hate that sort of thing, don't they? But in spite of all this Stephen's figure was handsome in a flat, broad-shouldered and slim-flanked fashion, and her movements were purposeful, having fine poise. She moved with the easy assurance of the athlete. Her hands, although large for a woman, were slender and meticulously tended. She was proud of her hands. In face she had changed very little since childhood, still having Sir Philip's wide, tolerant expression. What change there was only tended to strengthen the extraordinary likeness between father and daughter, for now that the bones of her face showed more clearly, as the childish fullness had gradually diminished, the formation of the resolute jaw was Sir Philip's. His too the strong chin with its shade of a cleft, the well-modeled, sensitive lips were his also. A fine face, very pleasing, yet with something about it that went ill with the hats on which Anna insisted, large hats trimmed with ribbons or roses or daisies, and supposed to be softening to the features. Staring at her own reflection in the glass, Stephen would feel just a little uneasy. Am I queer looking or not? She would wonder, suppose I wore my hair more like mother's. And then she would undo her splendid, thick hair, and would part it in the middle and draw it back loosely. The result was always far from becoming, so that Stephen would hastily play it again. She now wore the plait screwed up very tightly in the nape of her neck with a bow of black ribbon. Anna hated this fashion and constantly said so, but Stephen was stubborn. I've tried your way, mother, and I look like a scarecrow. You're beautiful, darling, but your young daughter isn't, which is jolly hard on you. She makes no effort to improve her appearance, Anna would reproach, very gravely. These days there was constant warfare between them on the subject of clothes, quite a seemly warfare, for Stephen was learning to control her hot temper, and Anna was seldom anything but gentle. Nevertheless, it was open warfare, the inevitable clash of two opposing natures who sought to express themselves in apparel, since clothes, after all, are a form of self-expression. The victory would be now on this side, now on that. Sometimes Stephen would appear in a thick woolen jersey, or a suit of rough tweeds surreptitiously ordered from the excellent tailor in Malvern. Sometimes Anna would triumph, having journeyed to London to procure soft and very expensive dresses, which her daughter must wear in order to please her, because she would come home quite tired by such journeys. On the whole, Anna got her own way at this time, for Stephen would suddenly give up the contest, reduced to submission by Anna's disappointment, always more efficacious than mere disapproval. Here, give it to me, she would say rather gruffly, grabbing the delicate dress from her mother. Then off she would rush and put it on all wrong, so that Anna would sigh in a kind of desperation, and would pat, readjust, unfasten and fasten, striving to make peace between wearer and model, whose inimical feelings were evidently mutual. Came a day when Stephen was suddenly outspoken. It's my face, she announced, something's wrong with my face. Nonsense! Exclaimed Anna, and her cheeks flushed a little, as though the girl's words had been an offense. Then she turned away quickly to hide her expression. But Stephen had seen that fleeting expression, and she stood very still when her mother had left her, her own face growing heavy and somber with anger, with a sense of some uncomprehended injustice. She wrenched off the dress and hurled it from her, longing intensely to rend it, to hurt it, longing to hurt herself in the process, yet filled all the while with that sense of injustice. But this mood changed abruptly to one of self-pity. She wanted to sit down and weep over Stephen. On a sudden impulse she wanted to pray over Stephen as though she were someone apart, yet terribly personal too in her trouble. Going over to the dress she smoothed it out slowly. It seemed to have acquired an enormous importance. It seemed to have acquired the importance of prayer, the poor, crumpled thing lying crushed and dejected. Yet Stephen, these days, was not given to prayer. God had grown so unreal, so hard to believe in since she had studied comparative religion. Engrossed in her studies she had somehow mislaid him. But now, here she was, very wishful to pray, while not knowing how to explain her dilemma. I'm terribly unhappy, dear, improbable God, would not be a very propitious beginning. And yet at this moment she was wanting a God, and a tangible one, very kind and paternal, a God with a white flowing beard and wide forehead, a benevolent parent who would lean out of heaven and turn his face sideways the better to listen from his cloud, upheld by cherubs and angels. What she wanted was a wise old family God, surrounded by endless heavenly relations. In spite of her troubles she began to laugh weakly, and the laughter was good for it killed self-pity, nor can it have offended that venerable person whose image persists in the hearts of small children. She donned the new dress with infinite precaution, pulling out its bows and arranging its ruffles. Her large hands were clumsy, but now they were willing, very penitent hands full of deep resignation. They fumbled and paused, then continued to fumble with the endless small fastenings so cunningly hidden. She sighed once or twice, but the sighs were quite patient, so perhaps in this wise, after all, Stephen prayed. Anna worried continually over her daughter. For one thing, Stephen was a social disaster, yet at 17 many a girl was presented, but the bare idea of this had terrified Stephen, and so it had to be abandoned. At garden parties she was always a failure, seemingly ill at ease and ungracious. She shook hands much too hard, digging rings into fingers, this from sheer automatic nervous reaction. She spoke not at all, or else gabbled too freely, so that Anna grew vague in her own conversation. All eyes and ears she would be as she listened. It was certainly terribly hard on Anna. But if hard on Anna, it was harder on Stephen, who dreaded these festive gatherings intensely. Indeed, her dread of them lacked all proportion, becoming a kind of unreasoning obsession. Every vestige of self-confidence seemed to desert her, so that Puddle, supposing she happened to be present, would find herself grimly comparing this Stephen with the graceful, light-footed, proficient young athlete, with the clever and somewhat opinionated student who was fast outstripping her own powers as a teacher. Yes, Puddle would sit there grimly comparing, and would feel not a little uneasy as she did so. Then something of her pupil's distress would reach her, so that perforce she would have to share it, and as like as not she would want to shake Stephen. Good Lord, she would think, why can't she hit back? It's absurd, it's outrageous to be so disgruntled by a handful of petty, half-educated yokels, a girl with her brain too. It's simply outrageous. She'll have to tackle life more forcibly than this, if she's not going to let herself go under. But Stephen, completely oblivious of Puddle, would be deep in the throes of her old suspicion, the suspicion that had haunted her ever since childhood. She would fancy that people were laughing at her. So sensitive was she, that a half-heard sentence, a word, a glance, made her inwardly crumble. It might well be that people were not even thinking about her, much less discussing her appearance. No good, she would always imagine that the word, the glance, had some purely personal meaning. She would twitch at her hat with inadequate fingers, or walk clumsily, slouching a little as she did so, until Anna would whisper, "Hold your back up, you're stooping." Or Puddle exclaimed crossly, "What on earth's the matter, Stephen?" All of which only added to Stephen's tribulation by making her still more self-conscious. With other young girls she had nothing in common, while they, in their turn, found her irritating. She was shy to primness regarding certain subjects, and would actually blush if they happened to be mentioned. This would strike her companions as queer and absurd. After all, between girls, surely every one knew that at times one ought not to get one's feet wet, that one didn't play games, not at certain times. There was nothing to make all this fuss about, surely. To see Stephen Gordon's expression of horror if one so much as threw out a hint on the subject, was to feel that the thing must in some way be shameful, a kind of disgrace, a humiliation. And then she was odd about other things too. There were so many things that she didn't like mentioned. In the end, they completely lost patience with her, and they left her alone with her fads and her fancies, disliking the check that her presence imposed, disliking to feel that they dare not allude to even the necessary functions of nature without being made to feel immodest. But at times Stephen hated her own isolation, and then she would make little awkward advances, while her eyes would grow rather apologetic, like the eyes of a dog who has been out of favor. She would try to appear quite at ease with her companions, as she joined in their light-hearted conversation. Strolling up to a group of young girls at a party, she would grin as though their small jokes amused her, or else listen gravely while they talked about clothes or some popular actor who had visited Malvern. As long as they refrained from too intimate details, she would fondly imagine that her interest passed muster. There she would stand with her strong arms folded, and her face somewhat strained in an effort of attention. While despising these girls, she yet longed to be like them. Yes, indeed, at such moments she longed to be like them. It would suddenly strike her that they seemed very happy, very sure of themselves as they gossiped together. There was something so secure in their feminine conclaves, a secure sense of oneness, of mutual understanding. Each in turn understood the other's ambitions. They might have their jealousies, their quarrels even, but always she discerned, underneath, that sense of oneness. Poor Stephen. She could never impose upon them. They always saw through her as though she were a window. They knew well enough that she cared not so much as a jot about clothes and popular actors. Conversation would falter, then die down completely. Her presence would dry up their springs of inspiration. She spoilt things while trying to make herself agreeable. They really liked her better when she was grumpy. Could Stephen have met men on equal terms, she would always have chosen them as her companions. She preferred them because of their blunt, open outlook, and with men she had much in common, sport for instance. But men found her too clever if she ventured to expand, and too dull if she suddenly subsided into shyness. In addition to this, there was something about her that antagonized slightly, an unconscious presumption. Shy though she might be, they sensed this presumption. It annoyed them, it made them feel on the defensive. She was handsome but much too large and unyielding both in body and mind, and they liked clinging women. They were oak trees, preferring the feminine ivy. It might cling rather close, it might finally strangle, it frequently did, and yet they preferred it, and this being so, they resented Stephen, suspecting something of the acorn about her. 3. Stephen's worst ordeals at this time were the dinners given in turn by a hospitable county. They were long, these dinners, overloaded with courses. They were heavy, being weighted with polite conversation. They were stately, by reason of the family silver. Above all, they were firmly conservative in spirit, as conservative as the marriage service itself, and almost as insistent upon sex distinction. "Captain Ramsay, will you take Miss Gordon into dinner?" A politely crooked arm. Delighted, Miss Gordon. Then the solemn and very ridiculous procession, animals marching into Noah's Ark 2 by 2, very sure of divine protection, male and female created he them. Stephen's skirt would be long and her foot might get entangled, and she with but one free hand at her disposal, the procession would stop and she would have stopped it. Intolerable thought, she had stopped the procession. "I'm so sorry, Captain Ramsay. I say, can I help you?" "No, it's really, all right, I think I can manage." But oh, the utter confusion of spirit, the humiliating feeling that someone must be laughing, the resentment at having to cling to his arm for support, while Captain Ramsay looked patient. "Not much damage, I think you've just torn the frill, but I often wonder how you women manage. Imagine a man in a dress like that, too awful to think of, imagine me in it." Then a laugh, not unkindly but a trifle self-conscious, and rather more than a trifle complacent. Safely steered to her seat at the long dinner table, Stephen would struggle to smile and talk brightly, while her partner would think, "Lord, she's heavy in hand, I wish I had the mother, now there's a lovely woman." And Stephen would think, "I'm a bore, why is it? Then, but if I were he I wouldn't be a bore, I could just be myself, I'd feel perfectly natural. Her face would grow splotched with resentment and worry, she would feel her neck flush and her hands become awkward. Embarrassed, she would sit staring down at her hands, which would seem to be growing more and more awkward. No escape. No escape. Captain Ramsay was kind-hearted, he would try very hard to be complimentary, his gray eyes would try to express admiration, polite admiration as they rested on Stephen. His voice would sound softer and more confidential, the voice that nice men reserve for good women, protective, respectful, yet a little sex-conscious, a little expectant of a tentative response. But Stephen would feel herself growing more rigid with every kind word and gallant allusion. Openly hostile she would be feeling, as poor Captain Ramsay or some other victim was manfully trying to do his duty. In such a mood as this she had once drunk champagne, one glass only, the first she had ever tasted. She had gulped it all down in sheer desperation, the result had not been Dutch courage but hiccups. Violent, insistent, incorrigible hiccups had echoed along the whole length of the table. One of those weird conversational lulls had been filled, as it were, to the brim with her hiccups. Then Anna had started to talk very loudly, Mrs. Antrim had smiled and so had their hostess. Their hostess had finally beckoned to the butler. "Give Miss Gordon a glass of water," she had whispered. After that Stephen shunned champagne like the plague, better hopeless depression, she decided, than hiccups. It was strange how little her fine brain seemed able to help her when she was trying to be social. In spite of her confident boasting to Raftery, it did not seem able to help her at all. Perhaps as was the clothes, for she lost all conceit the moment she was dressed as Anna would have her. At this period clothes greatly influenced Stephen, giving her confidence or the reverse. But be that as it might, people thought her peculiar, and with them that was tantamount to disapproval. And thus, it was being borne in upon Stephen, that for her there was no real abiding city beyond the strong, friendly old gates of Morton, and she clung more and more to her home and to her father. Perplexed and unhappy she would seek out her father on all social occasions and would sit down beside him. Like a very small child this large muscular creature would sit down beside him because she felt lonely, and because youth most rightly resents isolation, and because she had not yet learnt her hard lesson, she had not yet learnt that the loneliest place in this world is the no man's land of sex.